Welcome to this journey through one of the most perplexing and unsettling phenomena in modern America. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will challenge everything you thought you knew about the wilderness in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that spans decades, crosses state lines, and involves thousands of cases where ordinary people vanished without a trace in our nation's most beautiful landscapes, defying all logical explanation and leaving a legacy so disturbing that federal agencies have refused to maintain comprehensive records. Families shattered, searches abandoned, questions unanswered, and a pattern so specific, so repeating, that coincidence becomes impossible to accept. It was the year 1946. The world was emerging from the shadow of World War II, attempting to rebuild, to heal, to find normalcy in the chaos left behind. In the United States, families were discovering a new form of recreation, the national park. Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Great Smoky Mountains, these vast stretches of protected wilderness promised adventure, beauty, and escape from the industrial cities that had consumed so much of American life, but something else was waiting in those forests. The national parks of America are not merely tourist destinations. They are ecosystems unto themselves, millions upon millions of acres of untamed wilderness where nature operates according to its own ancient laws. The forests are dense, sometimes impenetrable. The terrain is unforgiving sheer cliffs that drop into oblivion, rivers that rage with snowmelt, caves that tunnel into the earth's very bones, mountains that scrape the clouds and hide their summits in perpetual mist. In these places, humans are visitors, temporary, fragile, small. The parks were established with noble intentions, to preserve America's natural heritage, to create sanctuaries where wildlife could thrive, where future generations could experience the wilderness as it existed before cities and highways carved up the continent. By the mid-20th century, they had become beloved institutions. Families loaded station wagons with camping gear and drove across state lines to pitch tents beneath towering pines. Hikers tested themselves against mountain trails. Children chased butterflies through meadows while their parents photographed waterfalls and elk herds. It seemed innocent, wholesome, safe. But in 1946, in a remote section of Yellowstone National Park, something happened that would begin a pattern that continues to this day, that has claimed hundreds, perhaps thousands of victims, and that remains largely unknown to the millions who visit these parks each year. A pattern of vanishing. The first case that drew serious attention involved a 3-year-old boy named Keith Parkins. His family, mother Margaret, father John, older sister Susan, had driven from their home in Denver to spend a week camping in Yellowstone. It was late June, the season when the park blooms with wildflowers and the weather turns warm enough for comfortable camping. According to the family's account, they had set up camp at a designated site near a trailhead. The area was popular, relatively well traveled, surrounded by other campers. Not isolated, not particularly dangerous. John Parkins was an experienced outdoorsman who had served in the war and knew how to navigate wilderness terrain. Margaret was cautious, vigilant with the children. On the third day of their trip, Keith vanished. The family had been preparing lunch. Margaret was at the campfire. John was organizing fishing gear. Susan was reading a book on a camp chair. Keith, wearing a distinctive red jacket, easy to spot, had been playing near the tent, no more than 20 yards from his parents, throwing pine cones, talking to himself in the way young children do. Margaret glanced away for perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps 45. When she looked back, Keith was gone. She called his name, no response. She walked to the spot where he'd been playing. His pine cones were scattered on the ground, his small footprints visible in the dirt. But beyond those few prints, nothing. John immediately began searching, moving in expanding circles around the campsite. Other campers heard Margaret's increasingly frantic calls and joined the search. Within an hour, park rangers arrived. By nightfall, search and rescue teams were combing the area with flashlights and dogs. They found nothing, no torn clothing, no blood, no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from the campsite except those of the searchers themselves. The search dogs, trained animals, experienced in wilderness rescue, picked up Keith's scent at the campsite, but lost it completely within yards. Not gradually, not fading into the distance as if he'd wandered off, lost, completely, as if Keith Parkins had simply ceased to exist. The search continued for 11 days. It became one of the most intensive operations in Yellowstone's history to that point. Rangers on horseback, teams on foot, helicopters when they became available, volunteers from neighboring towns. The Army sent personnel, local Native American trackers, men who had spent their entire lives reading the wilderness, joined the effort. The terrain was difficult but not impossible. There were no massive cliffs near by where Keith could have fallen, no rivers strong enough to carry away a small body without leaving evidence. The area was thoroughly, methodically searched. Every cave entrance, every deadfall, every thicket of brush. Keith Parkins was never found. The official report concluded that Keith had likely wandered off and succumbed to exposure, that wild animals had scattered his remains, that the wilderness, in its vastness, had simply swallowed him. The case was closed. The family returned to Denver, shattered, searching for answers that would never come. It should have been an isolated tragedy, rare but explicable. Children wander, wilderness is dangerous. Accidents happen, but Keith Parkins was not isolated. In 1952, a 63-year-old experienced hiker named Gerald Thompson disappeared on a marked trail in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He was hiking with a group of 4 friends. They stopped for a water break. Gerald said he wanted to photograph a particular vista from a rocky outcropping 30 feet off the trail. His friends waited. After 10 minutes, they went to check on him. Gerald Thompson was gone. His camera was on the rock where he'd been standing, lens cap removed, pointed at the valley below. His water bottle was beside it. His pack was still on his back when last seen. He had vanished in the space of 10 minutes, in clear weather, within earshot of 4 other people. The search lasted 2 weeks. Nothing was found. In 1957, a young couple honeymooning in Olympic National Park went for an afternoon hike. Martin and Claire Westbrook, both 24 years old, both athletic, both experienced with outdoor recreation. They told the lodge staff they'd be back by dinner. They took a popular trail well maintained, clearly marked. They never returned. The search found their car at the trailhead, found their footprints on the trail for approximately 2 miles. Then nothing, no sign of them leaving the trail, no evidence of injury or animal attack, no notes, no belongings left behind except their vehicle. Martin and Claire Westbrook joined the growing list of people who had walked into America's national parks and vanished as completely as if they had been erased from existence. By 1960, park rangers were beginning to notice patterns. Disappearances happened in clusters, certain parks, certain seasons, certain types of terrain. Most involved people who were outdoors, actively engaged in hiking or camping. The missing were often found, when they were found, in areas that had already been thoroughly searched multiple times. They appeared in locations that made no logical sense given their last known position and the time elapsed. And there were the children. Children represented a disproportionate number of disappearances. Young children between ages 2 and 6 who vanished from campgrounds, from trails, from areas where they were under direct supervision. The speed of these disappearances was particularly disturbing seconds, not minutes. Parents would turn their heads, and their children would be gone. In 1961, a 4-year-old boy named Dennis Martin disappeared in Great Smoky Mountains National Park under circumstances that would haunt his family for generations. The Martin family parents Bill and Lois, sons Dennis age 4 and Douglas age 7, grandfather Clyde, had joined several other families for a Father's Day camping trip. They were experienced campers. Bill Martin was a successful architect who had been taking his boys into the mountains since they were toddlers. The group was camping at Spence Field, a popular area with open meadows and established trails. On June 14, 1969, at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, Dennis and several other children decided to play a game. They would split into 2 groups, circle around a bush where the adults were sitting, and jump out to surprise them. It was a simple game, innocent, the kind of play children engage in without thought. Dennis was in a group with his brother and several other boys. They moved into the forest, giggling, planning their surprise. The distance from the adults was negligible, perhaps 100 feet. Perhaps slightly more. They were never out of earshot, until Dennis was. The other children emerged from the forest, shouting their surprise. The adults laughed, indulging the game. Then someone asked, "Where's Dennis?" The children looked around, confused. Dennis had been with them, just there, just seconds ago. They had been moving as a group, and then he wasn't there anymore. Bill Martin immediately began searching. He called Dennis's name, moved through the area where the children had been playing. Other adults joined him. They found the spot where the children had gathered to plan their surprise, a small clearing surrounded by rhododendron bushes. Dennis's footprints were visible in the soft earth, but beyond that clearing, nothing. Park rangers arrived within an hour. By nightfall, a massive search operation was underway. This search would become one of the most extensive in national park history. Over 1,400 people participated. Green Berets from Fort Bragg, National Guard units, dozens of park rangers, hundreds of volunteers, helicopters, planes, tracking dogs. They searched for 9 days, covered hundreds of square miles, found nothing. On the 6th day of the search, something strange happened. A tourist, a man named Harold Key, came forward with information. He had been hiking in the area on the day Dennis disappeared. At approximately 4:45 p.m., 15 minutes after Dennis vanished, Key had heard what he described as an enormous, primal scream, echoing through the forest. Not a child crying, not an animal he recognized, something else, something that made his blood run cold. The direction of the scream was uphill from where Dennis had disappeared, significantly uphill, over rough terrain that would be difficult for an experienced adult hiker, let alone a 4-year-old child. Rangers investigated the area Key described, found nothing, no evidence Dennis had ever been there. But other witnesses came forward with their own strange observations. A family camping nearby reported hearing a wild man moving through the forest on the evening. Dennis disappeared, something that walked upright, but moved through the underbrush in a way that didn't seem human. Multiple people reported hearing strange vocalizations, howls, screams, sounds that didn't match any known wildlife in the area. The official search was called off after 9 days. The conclusion was that Dennis had wandered into the forest, become disoriented, and died from exposure. that his body would likely never be found due to the difficult terrain and the possibility that scavengers had disturbed the remains. Bill Martin didn't accept that conclusion. He organized private searches, hired trackers, spent the rest of his life returning to those mountains, walking those trails, searching for answers. He found nothing. Dennis Martin remains missing. For decades, these disappearances existed as isolated incidents in individual park records. There was no centralized database, no systematic tracking. Each park maintained its own records, and those records were not comprehensive. Families would report their loved ones missing. Searches would be conducted. Cases would be closed. The patterns remained invisible because no one was looking at the larger picture. Until David Paulides. Paulides, a former law enforcement officer and investigator, began researching these disappearances in 2010 after receiving a tip from 2 park rangers who were concerned about the number of cases they had encountered. What began as curiosity evolved into an obsession. Paulides filed Freedom of Information Act requests, interviewed families, compiled data from dozens of national parks and forests. What he discovered was staggering. There was no official database tracking disappearances in national parks. The National Park Service had no comprehensive list. When Paulides requested such records, he was told they didn't exist. When he persisted, he was given incomplete information, redacted documents, and in some cases, outright refusals. The resistance was puzzling. These were public lands, taxpayer-funded. Why would the Park Service be reluctant to provide information about people who had gone missing under their watch? Paulides eventually compiled his own database. The numbers were shocking. Thousands of people had vanished in national parks and forests over the past century. The official count, when park officials provided any count at all, was always lower than the evidence suggested. Families reported cases that weren't in official records. Search and rescue personnel remembered cases that had been quietly closed and filed away. And the patterns Paulides identified were deeply disturbing. Pattern 1. The missing cluster's disappearances weren't random. They clustered in specific locations. Yosemite National Park in California had an extraordinarily high number of cases. So did the Great Smoky Mountains. So did Rocky Mountain National Park. So did Crater Lake in Oregon. These clusters occurred in areas with certain geographical features near water sources, near boulder fields, near areas with caves or underground geological formations. The terrain was often difficult but not impossible, not the most remote areas of the parks, not the places where you'd expect people to get lost and never found. Pattern 2. The profile missing people fit certain profiles more frequently than statistical chance would suggest. German descent was overrepresented. People with disabilities, autism, Down syndrome, cognitive impairments vanished at higher rates. Highly intelligent, physically fit individuals also disappeared in numbers that seemed disproportionate. Children ages 2 to 6, men ages 50 to 65. Pattern 3. The clothing when bodies were found, and they were found in perhaps 20 to 30% of cases. They were often partially or completely undressed. Shoes and socks removed. Clothing discarded along a route that made no logical sense. This happened in cases where hypothermia could not explain the behavior. It happened in warm weather. It happened with people who had shown no signs of disorientation before disappearing. Pattern 4. The locations where bodies were found appeared in areas that had been searched multiple times. Areas where search and rescue teams had literally walked through, sometimes multiple times per day, over the course of weeks. Suddenly, a body would be there, visible, impossible to miss, as if it had been placed there, or as if the person had still been alive, hiding or held somewhere, and only died recently despite having been missing for weeks. Pattern 5. The tracking dog's search dogs frequently failed in these cases. Experienced, highly trained search and rescue dogs would pick up a scent and lose it suddenly. Not fade away gradually, lose it, as if the person had been picked up and carried, or as if the scent had been deliberately masked or disrupted. In some cases, dogs would refuse to track at all, would whine, back away, show signs of fear or confusion. Their handlers, people who had worked with these animals for years, reported behavior they had never seen before. Pattern 6. The weather. Many disappearances were followed almost immediately by severe weather. Storms that washed away tracks. Rain that eliminated scent trails. Fog that reduced visibility to near zero and complicated search efforts. The timing was often remarkable. A person would vanish, and within hours, conditions would become nearly impossible for search operations. In 1999, a case occurred that highlighted the strangeness of these disappearances with particular clarity. Jared Atadero was 3 years old. He was hiking with a Christian singles group in the Powder River area of Colorado, near Rocky Mountain National Park. The group was walking on a well-used trail. Jared was excited, energetic, walking near the front of the group with some of the adults. At a certain point, the trail forked. Most of the group took one fork. A smaller group, including Jared, took another. The trails ran parallel for a short distance before diverging. Somewhere in those few minutes, Jared vanished. The search began immediately. Search and rescue teams arrived quickly. The area was combed thoroughly. Days passed, then weeks, no sign of Jared. 4 years later, hikers found some of Jared's clothing high on a mountain, miles from where he had disappeared. The items were in an area that had been searched multiple times during the initial investigation. They were laid out almost carefully, not scattered as if torn off by an animal, not weathered as if they had been exposed to 4 years of Colorado winters. The clothing told a disturbing story. Jared's shoes were there, still tied, his pants, his jacket, all intact. All in an area that made no logical sense for a 3-year-old boy to reach on his own steep, difficult terrain that would challenge experienced adult hikers. In 2003, more remains were found, partial skeletal remains that were confirmed as Jared's through DNA testing. But the bones raised more questions than they answered. Forensic analysis couldn't determine a cause of death, couldn't explain how the remains came to be in that location, couldn't explain the 4-year gap between disappearance and discovery in an area that had been thoroughly searched. Jared's father, Alain Atadero, became an advocate for families of missing people. He pushed for better tracking, better record keeping, better search protocols. He encountered the same resistance that David Paulides had faced: bureaucratic walls, missing records, officials who seemed more interested in minimizing the problem than solving it. The question becomes unavoidable. Why doesn't the National Park Service maintain comprehensive records of disappearances? When questioned, park officials offer various explanations: privacy concerns, the complexity of determining what constitutes an official disappearance, versus someone who is temporarily missing and later found, the difficulty of maintaining records across hundreds of parks and forests with different jurisdictions and reporting standards. These explanations are reasonable on the surface, but they don't hold up under scrutiny. The federal government maintains detailed databases for everything from campground reservations to trail maintenance schedules. The technology exists, the infrastructure is in place. creating and maintaining a database of missing persons would be relatively simple and would serve obvious public safety purposes. Yet it doesn't exist. Families who have lost loved ones in national parks report similar experiences when seeking information. Requests for search and rescue reports are denied or heavily redacted. Autopsy reports are difficult or impossible to obtain. Park officials are reluctant to discuss specific cases or provide statistics. This institutional opacity has fueled speculation, conspiracy theories, and increasingly wild explanations for the disappearances. In the absence of official information, people fill the void with their own theories. Some of these theories are grounded in mundane explanations. People get lost, wilderness is dangerous, human remains decompose quickly, especially in areas with active scavenger populations. Terrain can be disorienting, weather can be deadly. All of this is true, but these explanations don't account for the patterns. Don't explain why children vanish in seconds under direct supervision. Don't explain why bodies appear in areas that have been searched multiple times. Don't explain the consistent failure of tracking dogs or the strange behavior reported by witnesses. Other theories venture into darker territory. There are those who believe the disappearances are connected to human trafficking. That organized groups are operating in national parks, kidnapping people, especially children, for illegal purposes. The remoteness of the parks would make such operations easier. The vast acreage would provide cover. The transient nature of visitors would make patterns harder to detect. This theory has some surface plausibility. Human trafficking is a real and horrific crime. It happens, but the logistics don't quite work. Trafficking operations target vulnerable populations in places where disappearances are less likely to trigger massive search efforts: urban areas, border regions, communities with less social cohesion or law enforcement presence. Snatching children from national parks, where their disappearance immediately triggers extensive searches involving multiple agencies, doesn't fit the typical pattern of trafficking operations. Too much risk, too much attention, too likely to fail. Others point to wildlife. Could bears be responsible? Mountain lions. Both are present in national parks. Both are capable of killing humans, and both could potentially carry away remains. Again, this is partially plausible. Predator attacks happen, but they are rare, and they leave evidence: blood, tissue, torn clothing, tracks, scat containing human remains. The cases in question lack this evidence. Moreover, predators don't explain why bodies appear in previously searched areas. Don't explain the removal of clothing. Don't explain disappearances that happen in seconds from groups of people. Some researchers have suggested that underground cave systems, many of which are unmapped, could be swallowing people. Someone could fall into a concealed opening, drop into an underground chamber, and never be found. Caves can extend for miles, can flood during rains, can contain vertical shafts and tight passages that make rescue impossible. This theory has merit in some cases. Cave systems do exist beneath many national parks. People have died in them. But again, it doesn't explain the patterns, doesn't explain why search dogs lose scents, doesn't explain bodies appearing in locations with no cave access, doesn't explain the clustering of disappearances in specific areas that don't always correlate with known cave systems. And then there are the theories that venture beyond conventional explanation entirely. In the absence of satisfactory official explanations, some have looked to fringe theories. These should be presented for what they are: speculation, often lacking evidence, but arising from the profound frustration of families who have no other framework to understand their loss. Some believe that something non-human is responsible. Stories of wild men. In the forests, feral humans living off the grid, occasionally preying on visitors, have circulated in Appalachian communities for generations. These stories predate the modern national park system. They exist in folklore, passed down through families who have lived in the mountains for centuries. Could there be isolated groups of people living deep in the wilderness, avoiding all contact with civilization, occasionally crossing paths with hikers and campers? It's theoretically possible. The parks are vast. There are areas that see no human traffic for years at a time. Someone determined enough could potentially survive for extended periods. But surviving is different from thriving. Different from being capable of overpowering adults, carrying children across difficult terrain, and evading detection by search teams with helicopters and thermal imaging. The logistics of such an existence, obtaining food, shelter, staying healthy without medical care, make long-term wilderness survival in isolation extremely difficult. Others have pointed to Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or other cryptid creatures. These theories gained traction through online communities and documentary films that highlighted the missing persons cases alongside reports of unusual primate sightings. The correlation was noted. Areas with high numbers of disappearances often overlapped with areas where Bigfoot sightings had been reported. This is where we must acknowledge the limits of evidence-based discussion. Cryptozoology remains fringe science for good reason. The burden of proof for the existence of large, undiscovered primates in North America is high, and that proof has not materialized despite decades of searching. Blurry photographs and ambiguous footprints are not sufficient, yet the witnesses persist. Park rangers, hunters, long-term wilderness residents, people with no apparent reason to fabricate, report encounters with something that doesn't match known wildlife. Something bipedal, something large and intelligent enough to avoid detection. Could such creatures be responsible for disappearances? Even entertaining this question feels like abandoning rationality, but the gaps in conventional explanations leave space for people to wonder. What is certain is that the disappearances continue. In 2004, a young woman named Ashley Jessup vanished while hiking in the Adirondacks. She was with friends. They stopped to rest. Ashley said she was going to walk ahead to a specific landmark visible from where they sat, a large boulder formation perhaps 200 yards away. She started walking. Her friends watched her go, watched her reach the halfway point, and then she was gone. Not hidden behind terrain, not out of sight, simply gone. The search found her backpack several miles away, in a direction that made no sense given her stated destination. Her body was never found. In 2008, an experienced outdoorsman named Stephen Wilcox disappeared in Glacier National Park. He was solo backpacking, common practice for him, something he'd done hundreds of times. He filed a wilderness permit detailing his route. He had a satellite phone, a GPS device, emergency supplies. He checked in with his wife via satellite phone on his third day. Said everything was fine. Said he'd call again in 2 days when he reached his next checkpoint. He never called. Never reached the checkpoint. When rangers went to search, they found his camp from that third night. His tent was set up properly. His sleeping bag was inside. His satellite phone was charging on a portable solar panel. His GPS was on the ground beside the tent, still powered on, showing his location precisely. Stephen Wilcox was simply gone. His backpack was gone, but everything else, everything that would help rescuers find him, was left behind. The search lasted 3 weeks. Not a single trace was found beyond that camp. In 2013, 6-year Old Door Kuntz Jr., vanished during a camping trip with his family in Idaho. The circumstances were hauntingly familiar: child playing near his parents, disappeared in seconds, massive search with no results. The case remains unsolved. The theories range from tragic accident to parental involvement to abduction by persons unknown. What's notable is not the individual case but the pattern: another child, another second, long disappearance, another exhaustive search, another family left with no answers. In 2015, a college student named Jaron Kirk vanished while on a group hike in Zion National Park. He was 21, athletic, experienced with wilderness recreation. The group stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook. Jaron said he wanted to get a better view and walked about 50 feet to a higher vantage point. His friends heard a shout. Not a scream, just a brief, surprised shout. They looked over immediately seconds later, and Jaron was gone. The overlook was thoroughly searched. It wasn't a sheer cliff. It was a sloped area with plenty of handholds and places to catch yourself if you stumbled. There was no blood, no signs of a fall, no torn clothing caught on rocks. Search teams rappelled down the slope, checked every ledge and crevice, used drones with cameras, found nothing. 3 days later, Jaron's body was found at the bottom of a ravine 2 miles away. The location made no logical sense. The terrain between the overlook and where his body was discovered included obstacles that would be difficult to traverse intentionally, let alone while injured or disoriented. The autopsy was inconclusive about cause of death. He had injuries consistent with a fall, but also unexplained abrasions and marks that didn't fit the fall pattern. And there was no explanation for how he traveled 2 miles in a direction that had no logical connection to where he'd been. The National Park Service maintains that the parks are safe, that millions of people visit annually without incident, that disappearances, while tragic, are statistically rare given the volume of visitors and the inherent dangers of wilderness recreation. All of this is true. The parks are generally safe. The vast majority of visitors have wonderful, uneventful experiences. The disappearances, in terms of raw numbers, are a tiny percentage of total park visitors. But that statistical framing misses something crucial. It's not the total number of disappearances that's significant, it's the pattern, the consistency, the specific circumstances that repeat across decades and across geographically diverse locations. When the same type of disappearance happens again and again, when the circumstances show consistent elements that defy conventional explanation, when families report similar experiences with searches and official responses, it suggests something beyond random chance or typical wilderness accidents. David Paulides has faced criticism from some quarters skeptics who argue his pattern recognition is overstated, that he's cherry-picking cases, that he's promoting conspiracy theories for personal gain through book sales and speaking engagements. These criticisms have some validity. Pattern recognition can become pattern imposition. When you look for connections, you find them, even when they might not exist in any meaningful causal sense. Confirmation bias is real. The human brain is wired to find patterns, sometimes where none actually exist. But dismissing the research entirely because of these concerns ignores the legitimate questions that remain unanswered. Why is there no comprehensive database? Why are families stonewalled when seeking information? Why do so many cases involve similar circumstances? Some former park rangers have spoken about the cases, though often only after retirement and often only anonymously. Their accounts add texture to the mystery. One ranger, who worked in Yosemite for over 20 years, described a case from the 1990s. A young boy, 8 years old, vanished from a campground. The search was massive, hundreds of people, days of effort. On the 5th day, the boy was found alive, unconscious but uninjured, in an area that had been searched multiple times. When he regained consciousness, the boy described being carried through the forest by someone he couldn't see clearly. He said he was terrified but couldn't cry out, said he was placed on the ground and told to stay there. Then whoever or whatever had carried him was gone. Medical examination found no signs of trauma, no drugs in his system, no evidence he'd been restrained. But his story never changed. Years later, as an adult, he maintained the same account. Something had carried him. The ranger who recounted this story said it was far from unique, said there were other cases, other children found alive in impossible locations with similar stories. Stories that were never included in official reports. Stories that rangers learned not to talk about because doing so invited ridicule or career complications. Another former ranger, this one from Rocky Mountain National Park, spoke about a case involving an experienced climber who vanished from a technical route. The climber was with a partner. They were roped together. The partner looked down to check his gear, a matter of seconds, and when he looked up, the climber was gone. Not fallen, not visible below, gone. The rope had been cut, not frayed as if it had broken under stress. Cut cleanly with something sharp. The partner was climbing solo from that point, in shock, unable to comprehend what had happened. He managed to descend safely and reported what he'd witnessed. Search teams found no trace of the missing climber. The cut rope was analyzed. The cut was clean, consistent with a sharp blade, but no explanation could be offered for how it happened on a cliff face with only 2 people present. There's another element to these cases that deserves attention: the psychological impact on families and on the communities surrounding the parks. When someone vanishes without explanation, without closure, the grief is uniquely painful. It's ambiguous loss. The person is gone but not confirmed dead. Hope and despair exist simultaneously. Families can never fully move forward because there's always the possibility, however remote, that their loved one might be found alive. This type of loss can be devastating psychologically. It prevents the normal grieving process. It keeps wounds perpetually open. And in these cases, it's compounded by the lack of information, the sense that authorities know more than they are saying, the frustration of incomplete investigations. Some families have spent decades searching, have devoted their entire lives to finding answers, have bankrupted themselves funding private searches and investigations. The emotional toll is incalculable, and in the communities that border national parks, small towns where families have lived for generations, there's a cultural memory of the disappearances. Warnings passed down, areas considered dangerous not because of documented hazards, but because of stories. Because of what happened to someone's cousin in 1978. Because of what a grandmother saw in 1945. These communities have a complex relationship with the parks. The parks bring tourism, bring revenue, bring jobs, but they also bring loss, bring questions, bring something that people who live in their shadow seem to understand intuitively, even if they can't explain it rationally. Talk to people who grew up in the towns around Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and they'll tell you about places you don't go. Not because there are signs saying keep out, not because it's illegal, but because it's understood. Because people who go there sometimes don't come back. Because the mountains themselves feel different in those places. Watchful, hungry, this sounds like superstition, like the kind of folklore that emerges in rural areas disconnected from modern understanding. But dismiss it too quickly. and you miss the accumulated wisdom of people who have lived in close proximity to these landscapes for lifetimes. So, what are we left with? What can be reasonably concluded from this web of disappearances, patterns, and missing answers? First, it's clear that people do vanish in national parks under circumstances that defy easy explanation. The numbers are disputed. Paulides suggests thousands. Officials suggest hundreds, but even taking the most conservative estimates, there are significant numbers of cases that remain unsolved and deeply puzzling. Second, the patterns are real, even if their cause is unclear. The clustering of disappearances in specific locations, the consistent failure of search methods that work elsewhere, the strange circumstances surrounding many cases these elements repeat consistently to dismiss as coincidence. Third, the institutional response from the National Park Service has been inadequate. Whether through bureaucratic inertia, genuine resource constraints, or deliberate minimization, the lack of comprehensive record keeping and the resistance to transparency has fueled speculation and denied families the information they deserve. What we cannot do, what we must resist doing, is leap from acknowledged mysteries to unsupported conclusions. The gaps in our understanding are real, but filling those gaps with speculation about cryptids, underground trafficking networks, or supernatural forces doesn't bring us closer to truth. It provides narrative satisfaction, but not answers. The most likely explanation, or rather, set of explanations, is probably more mundane but no less tragic. Some disappearances are undoubtedly fatal accidents in terrain, more dangerous than visitors realize. People underestimate wilderness. They hike beyond their skill level. They make small mistakes that cascade into tragedy. They fall into concealed ravines, break through thin ice over frozen streams, suffer medical emergencies in remote locations. The wilderness is efficient at hiding human remains. Scavengers scatter bones. Vegetation overgrows. Water washes away evidence. Thermal conditions in certain microclimates can accelerate decomposition. A body can become effectively invisible in remarkably little time. Some disappearances may involve foul play, not organized trafficking, but opportunistic predators. Human predators, people who visit parks specifically to find vulnerable targets. The remoteness that makes parks beautiful also makes them ideal for certain crimes. And if remains are never found, there's never a crime scene, never forensic evidence, never a way to distinguish criminal action from tragic accident. The failures of search methods, the dogs losing sense, the bodies appearing in searched areas might be explained by factors we don't fully understand about scent behavior in wilderness environments. Wind patterns, thermal layers, the way human scent interacts with diverse terrain. Our confidence in these methods might exceed their actual reliability. But these rational explanations, while likely accounting for many cases, still leave uncomfortable gaps. They don't explain the speed of certain disappearances. A child vanishing in the seconds a parent looks away. An adult disappearing from a group in the time it takes for their companions to tie their shoes. They don't explain the consistency of certain elements. The removed clothing found in impossible locations. The discovery of remains only after areas have been thoroughly searched multiple times. The reports from multiple unconnected witnesses describing similar strange occurrences. They don't explain why certain areas seem to be focal points. Why the same trails, the same meadows, the same sections of certain parks appear again and again in case files. And they don't explain the institutional resistance to documentation and transparency. Perhaps there's a simpler explanation for this last element, one that doesn't require conspiracy, but merely acknowledges institutional self-interest. The National Park Service depends on visitors. Its funding, its mandate, its very existence is predicated on Americans viewing national parks as valuable resources worthy of support and visitation. Comprehensive documentation of disappearances, official acknowledgement of unsolved mysteries, public discussion of the cases. All of this could impact visitor numbers, could generate negative publicity, could lead to lawsuits from families arguing the parks failed in their duty to warn visitors of dangers. From an institutional perspective, the incentive structure favors minimization, not active cover-up necessarily, but passive resistance. Don't compile statistics that might be troubling. Don't make information easily accessible. Let individual cases remain isolated rather than part of a visible pattern. This explanation is cynical, but not implausible. It's how bureaucracies often operate not through malice, but through risk aversion and organizational self-preservation. There's one more element worth considering, one that might synthesize many of these threads into something approaching a coherent understanding. The national parks preserve wilderness, but wilderness is itself a complicated concept. These are not pristine, untouched landscapes. They're ecosystems that were actively managed by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before European contact. They're recovering forests, in many cases, regrown after logging and agricultural clearing. They contain the remnants of human activity, old homesteads, mining operations, abandoned settlements, forgotten roads. They're also changing. Climate change is altering wildlife patterns, vegetation zones, water sources. Animals are moving into new ranges. Plants are dying or thriving in response to shifting conditions. The parks we visit today are not the same as the parks of 50 years ago, and they won't be the same 50 years hence. In this context of change and complexity, might there be ecological or geological factors we don't fully understand? Pockets of carbon dioxide, accumulation in certain valleys that can cause sudden loss of consciousness. Unmapped cave systems that occasionally collapse, creating sinkholes that swallow unwary hikers. Localized magnetic anomalies that confuse both human navigation and the electronic devices we rely on. We know that certain geographic features can create optical illusions, mirages, fog effects, visual distortions caused by specific light and atmospheric conditions. Could similar phenomena affect sound, making it impossible for victims to hear rescuers or for rescuers to hear victims even when they're relatively close? We know that certain weather patterns can develop with startling speed in mountainous terrain, localized storms, white-out conditions, temperature drops that can be fatal to the unprepared. Could microclimates in specific locations be more dangerous than currently recognized? We know that wildlife behavior is not fully understood, that animals can be unpredictable, that predators occasionally exhibit behavior that doesn't match their typical patterns. Could there be more wildlife-related fatalities than are recognized, with remains scattered or consumed before they can be found? None of this is exotic. None requires conspiracies or cryptids. But it suggests that the wilderness is more complex, more variable, and more dangerous than our modern minds, trained to expect predictability and control, are comfortable acknowledging. What haunts these cases is not just the loss, but the uncertainty. The families left behind don't have bodies to bury, crimes to prosecute, or accidents to prevent in the future. They have only absence, only the last moments they remember, a child laughing, a loved one waving goodbye, a voice saying, "I'll be right back," and then nothing. Forever, in our modern world, This kind of unknowing feels intolerable. We have technology that can track individual trees in the Amazon via satellite. We have DNA databases that can identify remains from tiny fragments of bone. We have search equipment that can detect heat signatures through dense foliage. Yet people still vanish, still leave no trace, still defy our capabilities and our understanding. There's a temptation to find this comforting in a strange way, to celebrate the existence of genuine mystery in an over-explained world, to take satisfaction in knowing that the wilderness still holds secrets, that nature can still humble our technological confidence. But that temptation is a luxury available only to those who haven't lost someone. For the families, there's no romance in mystery, only pain, only questions that echo unanswered through decades. Bill Martin searched for his son Dennis for the rest of his life. He died in 1998, never knowing what happened that Father's Day in 1969, never finding closure, never able to properly grieve because grief requires knowing what you've lost, and he never had that certainty. Alain Atadero at least found some of his son Jared's remains, but those remains raised more questions than they answered. Where had Jared been for 4 years? How did his clothing end up laid out so carefully in a location that made no sense? What happened during those hours or days after he vanished? These families deserve answers. They deserve truth. They deserve a National Park Service willing to acknowledge the scope of the problem, maintain comprehensive records, and dedicate resources to understanding why these disappearances keep happening. Since David Paulides began publishing his research, there has been some progress. Some park rangers have advocated for better protocols. Some families have successfully pressured for more thorough investigations. Some cases that might have been closed prematurely have remained open longer. But the fundamental issues remain: no comprehensive database, no systematic analysis of patterns, no official acknowledgement that there's a problem requiring coordinated response. In 2020, Congress began considering legislation that would require the National Park Service to maintain records of all missing persons cases and make those records publicly accessible. The legislation faced opposition, some from privacy advocates concerned about releasing information about missing persons without family consent, some from Park Service officials arguing about resource constraints and reporting burden. As of now, that legislation has not passed. The issue remains in bureaucratic limbo, discussed occasionally but never prioritized, always seeming urgent until it's not, always postponed for another legislative session. Meanwhile, the disappearances continue. In 2021, a woman vanished while hiking alone in Sequoia National Park. Experienced hiker, clear weather, well-traveled trail, she simply never returned to her car. The search found no trace. She joined the list. In 2022, a teenager disappeared during a youth group camping trip in Yellowstone. He had been with friends. They were playing a game. He ran ahead to hide. He was never seen again. Another search. Another family shattered. Another case filed away. In 2023, an elderly couple, married 50, 2 years, experienced campers vanished during a trip to Olympic National Park. Their RV was found at their campsite. Their belongings were inside. No signs of distress or struggle. They had simply walked away and never returned, both of them, at the same time, with no explanation. If you're planning to visit a national park, and you should, because they are magnificent, important, and generally safe, there are precautions you can take. Stay on marked trails. This advice is repeated endlessly, and there's a reason. The trails are the safest routes through the parks. They're maintained, they're monitored, there where search efforts concentrate first. Tell someone your plans. File a wilderness permit if you're backcountry camping. Give specific itineraries to family or friends. The difference between being found in hours versus days can be life or death. Carry communication devices. Cell phones often don't work in remote areas, but satellite messengers are increasingly affordable and reliable. Personal locator beacons can summon rescue even when you can't communicate your situation verbally. Don't separate from your group. This is especially crucial with children. The seconds it takes for a child to wander out of sight can be the seconds that determine whether they're found safe or become a statistic. Trust your instincts. If an area feels wrong, if something makes you uneasy, honor that feeling. Human intuition is pattern recognition operating below conscious awareness. Sometimes we sense danger before we can articulate why. Be realistic about your abilities. Most accidents in wilderness happen because people overestimate their fitness, their navigation skills, their ability to handle unexpected situations. There's no shame in turning back, no glory in pushing beyond what's safe, but beyond practical advice, these cases force us to confront something deeper about our relationship with nature. We've convinced ourselves that we've conquered the wilderness, that technology has made us safe everywhere, that understanding equals control, that if we can map something, we can master it. The disappearances suggest otherwise. They remind us that there are still places where we are not the dominant species, not the most powerful presence, not guaranteed safety simply because we expect it. The wilderness is not a theme park. It's not a curated experience. It's an ecosystem that operates according to its own laws, indifferent to human presence and human needs. This is uncomfortable knowledge. It conflicts with the narrative we prefer, the story where humans are special, protected, destined to survive and thrive because of our intelligence and our tools. But the mountains don't care about that story. The forests don't acknowledge our assumed superiority. In those places, we're just another animal, vulnerable, temporary, fragile. Maybe that's the real mystery these disappearances point toward. Not a specific cause, not cryptids or caves or criminals, but a fundamental reality we've forgotten, that we are not separate from nature, that the boundaries we've created between civilized and wild are illusions, that the wilderness is always there, always waiting, always ready to reclaim what we've temporarily borrowed. Indigenous peoples understood this. Their traditions emphasized respect for the land, acknowledgement of forces beyond human comprehension, rituals and protocols for moving safely through dangerous places. Much of this knowledge was dismissed as superstition by European settlers eager to exploit and control the landscape. But maybe those traditions carried genuine wisdom. Maybe they were tried and tested methods for navigating genuine dangers. Maybe the protocols, the offerings, the prayers, the careful attention to signs and omens were not magical thinking but practical safety measures encoded in cultural practice. The story of disappearances in national parks is ongoing. It's not a historical mystery we can wrap up with a neat conclusion. It's happening now, this year, this month. Perhaps as you're watching this, someone is planning a trip to a national park. They're excited, they're prepared, they have good equipment, good weather, good intentions, and there's a chance, a small but real chance, that they won't come back, that they'll become another name in an unofficial list, another case file, another family searching for answers that may never come. We can't prevent all of these disappearances. Accidents will happen, people will make mistakes, the wilderness will remain dangerous. But we can do better. We can demand better record keeping, We can insist on transparency. We can support research into understanding the patterns. We can honor the families who have lost loved ones by taking their experiences seriously and working to prevent future tragedies. And we can change how we approach wilderness itself, with more humility, with more respect, with recognition that these places are not ours to command, but to visit carefully, gratefully, aware that we're guests in a realm that was here long before us, and will remain long after we're gone. The mountains are ancient, the forests have their own memory, the caves run deeper than we've mapped, and the trails lead to places we haven't named. In those places, different rules apply, older rules, rules we might not understand but would be wise to respect. On certain nights, in certain valleys of the Great Smoky Mountains, people report hearing sounds they can't explain. Calls that echo between the peaks, voices that seem to speak in languages nobody recognizes, footsteps that follow just beyond the edge of firelight. Are these the sounds of missing people, still lost, still calling for help years after they vanished? Are they acoustic tricks, wind through particular rock formations, animals whose vocalizations we've misinterpreted? Are they the sounds of whatever took those people, still hunting, still hungry? We don't know. That's the uncomfortable truth. We don't know. What we know is that the wilderness keeps its secrets well, that people who enter those spaces don't always return, that the maps we've made show only the surface of something deeper and stranger than we've acknowledged. The next time you stand at a trailhead, about to enter the forest, take a moment. Feel the weight of the trees. Listen to the silence beneath the bird calls. Notice how the path disappears into shadows that seem somehow deeper than they should be. And remember that you're crossing a threshold, leaving a world of laws and explanations, entering a place where different principles operate, where you might be safe, where you should be safe, but where safety is not guaranteed, and where those who came before you with the same expectations sometimes found something else entirely. Dennis Martin is still out there. Somewhere in the mountains he disappeared into 4 years ago. Jared Atadero is still in the forests that took him. Gerald Thompson, Claire and Martin Westbrook, Stephen Wilcox, Ashley Jessup, hundreds of others whose names we know and thousands whose names we don't. They're all still out there. In the caves, in the trees, in the soil, in the silence. The wilderness keeps what it takes, and it's still taking. The story of disappearances in national parks remains a disturbing reminder that there are limits to human knowledge, to human control, to human safety. That the world contains mysteries we haven't solved and may never solve. That the boundaries between known and unknown, safe and dangerous, life and death, are thinner than we'd like to believe. But questions remain. Why do these patterns persist? Why does the clustering continue in the same locations decade after decade? What is it about certain geographical features, certain types of terrain, certain parks that makes them focal points for disappearance? To this day, families are still searching, still organizing private investigations, still returning to the trails where their loved ones vanished, hoping for some sign, some clue, some fragment of closure that the official searches never provided. And on silent nights, when the moon rises over the mountain peaks and the forests settle into darkness, people still report strange lights in the valleys, still hear sounds that don't match any known wildlife, still feel the presence of something watching from the tree line. The national parks are beautiful. They are treasures. They are essential to our natural heritage and our collective soul. Visit them, experience them, let them transform you, but go carefully. Go humbly. Go with awareness that you're entering a realm that operates according to its own ancient logic. Because the wilderness remembers every person who's vanished into its embrace, and it's always, always hungry for more. If this journey through one of America's most disturbing ongoing mysteries resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the thin line between the known and the unknown that exists in our most beautiful wild places, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time, secrets hidden in plain sight, histories that challenge everything we thought we understood about the world. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it made you reconsider your relationship with wilderness and mystery. And comment below sharing your own perspectives. Have you experienced something unexplainable in a national park? Do you have theories about these disappearances? Have you lost someone to the wilderness, or do you know someone who has? The conversation continues, the mystery endures, and somewhere, in a forest or a mountain range or a valley you might visit tomorrow, the wilderness is waiting. Until next time, step carefully into the unknown.